Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When the Clone Wars started, both the Republic and the Separatist Navy were concentrated on pumping out as many capital ships as possible. For the Republic, it was all about getting the newly designed destroyer carrier, the Venator class, into action. They would serve as mobile hubs for the Republic's quickly growing starfighter corps. This would be a cheap way for the clones to immediately counter the Separatist alliance, which was rapidly spreading across the Outer Rim, attacking Republic-aligned worlds. For the Separatist Navy, the answer was the Subjugator Class Dreadnought, known as the Malevolence. This was supposed to be an answer to the Venator, a terror weapon with an ion cannon so large that it could disable entire fleets in just a single shot, making them an easy target for the Malevolence's 500 dual turbolasers. The Malevolence was a clear problem for the Republic Navy, and it was quite successful at its mission of creating chaos. Within a few outings, it managed to completely wipe out several fleets of Venator Class Star Destroyers. And I do mean completely, not a single survivor or any of those incidents were left behind to tell the Republic what the hell was actually happening to their ships. That's how powerful this ion cannon was, and how ruthless the Separatist hunter-killer squads were when they scoured the ruins of Republic fleets and eliminated any survivors they could find in the wreckage. Now at the time, the Republic was ready on their back foot. The Separatist droid army was far better prepared for the opening salvo of the conflict and had numbers and initiative on their side. Already dozens of worlds were under attack and besieged. Worlds like Christophus, Bothawai, Faline, and Ryloth. To make matters worse, on a lot of these contested planets, you saw old rivalries and factions start fighting amongst each other, creating civil wars on these planets, and usually these factions would join up with the larger galactic factions fighting in the Clone Wars. Before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor for today's video, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, a turn-based tactical strategy game set in the grimdark epic Warhammer 40,000 universe. As y'all know, I'm a very enthusiastic supporter of humanity, and so it's only natural for me to enjoy the passion the Imperium of Man has for destroying the wretched Xeno threats that dot the galactic landscape. In Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, build a team from over 70 legendary heroes and fight your way through an exciting PvE campaign before getting your hands dirty in some fast-paced PvP action. You could even choose some of your favorite chapters of the Space Marines like the Blood Angels or Space Wolves. You could also play for the Xenos, but you're not gonna betray humanity, right? Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is a constantly evolving game, as developer Snowprint Studios is constantly adding new features, game modes, and new events to the core game. So check out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, we've linked it in the description down below. The Grand Army of the Republic not only lacked manpower, but also combat vehicles and ships to counter this massive offensive. The Separatist Navy had been able to operate freely months before the Venator Class Star Destroyer was even deployed from Quantrive Yards, and so the Republic was behind a lot. And as the Republic continued to prove that it was incapable of providing security for its member states, more and more Outer Rim worlds started embracing the Separatist movement, creating a feared domino effect. The rumor that some Separatist superweapon was now flying around in the Outer Rim, disappearing entire Republic fleets, was the last thing the Republic needed, and so destroying the Malevolence became priority number one. They needed to stem the bleeding. Anakin Skywalker came along with a pretty obvious solution to the Malevolence problem. They needed something much smaller than a capital ship, something that was nimble and could avoid the large ion blast that came from the Malevolence. At the same time, the ship had to be large enough to have a payload that actually could damage a ship of this size, which was, roughly 5 kilometers in length. What they ideally needed was a fighter bomber. At this point, the Republic was heavily focused on the fighter-carrier strategy, but the fighters they've incorporated up until this point were all pretty lightly armed multi-purpose units like the V-19, which carried only concussion missiles, good for fighter-versus-fighter combat or damaging lighter ships like a Corvette class or ground vehicles. What Anakin was looking for was a fighter that could actually carry proton torpedoes, which were some of the most powerful munitions that a fighter could actually carry on board. Now, due to the Republic's 1,000 years of peace prior to the Clone Wars, the entire concept of a fighter bomber became pretty obsolete. Most of the militarized ships in the galaxy were owned either by planetary defense forces, corporate security, or by pirates and bandits. And these type of lighter armed groups generally just use interceptors and space superiority vessels alongside up-armored and armored civilian freighters. Fighter bombers were just unnecessary and kind of went against the spirit of the Rusan Reformation and the Republic's demilitarized policies. The idea of just dropping bombs indiscriminately on a target is not something you generally do when you're peacekeeping or functioning as the police. But then again, back then, they didn't have 5-kilometer long megaships destroying entire fleets. And so the Republic fleet didn't technically have a fighter bomber. The only reason that Anakin managed to find any for the mission against the Malevolence was because he was an avid starfighter enthusiast whose interest in the starfighter industry was only rivaled by individuals like Sassy Tin and Plo Koon in the Jedi Order. Anakin Skywalker knew that Conan Sayre Manufacturing, which was a ship parts manufacturer, was building a fighter bomber in an attempt to secure a contract with the Republic Navy. Now, I'm guessing Anakin probably stayed up all night and looked up the specs on this new platform and got excited by what he saw. And being the giant risk taker that he was, he quickly considered using this untested platform from a company that wasn't even known for manufacturing ships. Conan Sayre Manufacturing was kind of on the vendor supplier end of the larger ecosystem for starfighters. They built parts and components like engines, hyperdrives, even helmets and flight suits. But seeing the opportunities that the Clone Wars presented, they decided to cobble together what would become one of the most legendary and long-lived fighter bombers in galactic history, the BTLB Y-Wing. And let me tell you something, this fighter bomber looked and was designed like a prototype. It had a lot of problems, and actually, I think if it wasn't for Anakin Skywalker, they would have struggled to secure a contract with the Republic. So in a lot of ways, the Y-Wing's existence, the Y-Wing's legacy, which we'll be talking about a lot in this video, are all thanks to Anakin Skywalker. Because this ship had a lot of teething issues. For instance, its massive ion engines overheated constantly and tended to run hot, creating performance issues, and also making the ship very visible on enemy scanners. The engines also relied on an extremely complex cooling system that extended through the entire ship, adding a lot of weight and maintenance problems to the vessel. The entire package was massive too, at 23.4 meters long, especially when you compare it to the tiny droid interceptors it went up against. It also had mediocre maneuverability and top speed. But what it did have were two MG7 proton torpedo launchers, and it could hold up to 12 proton torpedoes, which could, destroy an entire blockade of capital ships if used properly. Proton torpedoes are not normal warheads in any shape or form. Concussion missiles are more of what we like to think of when it comes to missiles. Proton torpedoes have the destructive capabilities of a focused nuclear warhead. Anakin Skywalker knew that the only way to get through the Malevolence's shields and armor was to use a weapon with this powerful of a yield. Skywalker, without any other options, requested that Conan Sayre send over all of their working prototypes, but he actually found resistance from Senator Ask, who was in charge of the Y-Wing project at the time. Apparently, he had a bone to pick with the Jedi, and he just wanted to screw over the Jedi at every opportunity possible. And he also probably believed that the Y-Wing project wasn't really ready for the battlefield. He might have been right about that, actually. But Anakin was really bad at taking no for an answer. And so he would actually visit the planet of Conan Sayre directly and just take all the Y-Wings he could for this operation. Anakin Skywalker would assemble what was known as Shadow Squadron, and they would quickly launch a sortie against the Malevolence, which at the time was on the verge of destroying a Republic orbital medical station. That's some really evil stuff right there. And this risky, bold move played off. The Y-Wings turned out to be just enough, which is a great way to describe their combat capabilities and performance. Just enough. And as the Y-Wings approached the Malevolence, almost half of Shadow Squadron were caught up in the ion weapon's massive blast. Several more would be destroyed in the attack run from point defense turrets and enemy fighters, but after a quick shift of targets, Shadow Squadron managed to strike the Subjugator's main ion weapon, causing it to malfunction. The ensuing explosion also destroyed the ship's hyperdrive. This gave the Republic fleet an opening to attack the Malevolence, and several Venator Class Star Destroyers would give chase, and the giant ship would go down like the Bismarck. Fighter bombers really just have to do two things. It's not a really sexy, starfighter. One, it has to run a gauntlet of anti-air defenses, which the Y-Wing was relatively capable of. It was quite a durable ship. And two, it needed to be a payload specialist, which the Y-Wing was also pretty good at. I mean, this was a pretty large fighter bomber, especially for its time. when there weren't any fighter bombers really on the market. And this design, while pretty standard, was just enough and got the job done. And so despite Koenigsegger's lack of experience in designing starfighters, the sum of all of the Y-Wing's design features put together was what made it work. Which is why after this battle, the Y-Wing would enter mass production and become the most widely used fighter bomber by the Republic Navy during the Clone Wars. During the blockade of Ryloth, Commander Tano would use several squadrons of Y-Wings to engage and destroy the numerically superior Separatist naval blockade. Once again, the powerful payload of these ships, plus their durability, proved to be too much for the Separatist defenses. The BTLB Y-Wing was also a favorite amongst ground pounders because of its close air support capabilities, even though the Y-Wing's flight characteristics in atmosphere were kind of sketchy and questionable. This thing was basically a flying brick. Close air support was especially important because the Seppies usually outnumbered the clone troopers by as much as 10 times on most battlefields. Only through combined arms tactics and coordinated airstrikes and good maneuverability could the clones hope to survive these types of engagements. A carefully directed Y-Wing proton bomb drop could change the course of an entire battle within minutes and destroy entire battalions of enemy forces, which would be a lot more costly to do if you had to just use small arms and, engage droids in closer range blaster fights. The Y-Wing, as we'll see during the Battle of Anaxos, was also very potent for hunting down anti-air defenses, clearing the way for other starfighters and air assets. It was heavily armored enough and had enough firepower to go toe-to-toe with enemy ground emplacements. The Y-Wing was also one of the few ships that could carry the dreaded electro-proton bomb. This was a weapon of mass destruction that could completely envelop a battlefield in a powerful EMP, which destroyed droids but left organics relatively unharmed. That ringing noise you hear is not service-related. This was a complete game-changer and equalizer for the clone army. The clones clearly would have lost many more ground engagements without the help of the Y-Wing, especially in the earlier years of the war where the clones were not only outnumbered but usually didn't have as much firepower at their disposal. The Y-Wing would prove to be one of the Republic's most successful and important fighters throughout the entire conflict. I would go as far to say that the Y-Wing is what probably won the war for the Republic more than any other platform. It was an indispensable weapon both in space and on the ground, and it also personally saved the lives of some pretty important figures. The Y-Wing saved Nala Se from certain death on the Khalida Shoals Medical Center during that Malevolence attack we talked about before. It prevented Anakin Skywalker's forces from being overrun on Umbara, and prevented Obi-Wan Kenobi's forces from suffering a similar fate during the Second Battle of Geonosis. Those are two very important Jedi for galactic history. Perhaps equally as important, the Y-Wing saved Captain Rex and Ahsoka Tano from the wreckage of the Star Destroyer Tribunal after the siege of Mandalore. What's even more impressive is the Y-Wing service post-Clone Wars. I mean, this thing lasted way longer than its designers ever thought it would. The Empire viewed larger, slower starships as obsolete due to the lessons the Republic learned during the Battle of Coruscant, where smaller and more nimble droid fighters tore apart the Republic's larger starfighters. And so the Y-Wing, despite only being 3 years old and just a few more upgrades and versions away from being a really formidable fighter bomber, was shelved. A good portion of the Republic's Y-Wings were sold off to either local defense forces or corporate security, but the majority of these ships were actually sold to military surplus yards and also scrap yards, which is kind of sad. If you take a close look at the used shipyard on Ferrix, which was a major shipbreaking world, you can see a Clone Wars era Y-Wing just chilling right there out in the open. You can also get a sense of just how massive these things were. Now, the Rebel movement very early on started looking for hyperdrive-equipped fighter bombers because of the sheer scale of the operation they were going to take on by fighting the Imperial military and the size of their capital ships. Initially equipped with only A-wing interceptors and a few, diplomatic cruisers and corvettes, the Rebel Alliance were looking for the same type of firepower in a small package that Anakin had looked for almost 2 decades earlier. With the Empire levying strict controls and monitoring all types of arms sales and the sales of starfighters, the Rebels basically had to rely on the second-hand market. Early Rebel units funded by Bail Organa and Mon Mothma would routinely find themselves limited to purchasing Y-Wings. In one incident on the planet of Yarma, a Rebel cell managed to steal an entire squadron of Y-Wings from an Imperial decommissioning center right before they were destroyed. There were so many Y-Wings for the Rebels to steal or buy that it became one of the most popular ships in the entire fleet. And so Rebel mechanics actually developed their own modded version of the ship, the BTLA-4, which basically removes the rear turret and the engine nacelles from the BTLB variant to make the starship lighter and to make it easier for maintenance work to be done. The Rebels wouldn't just use the Y-Wing for fighter bomber assault type missions, they would use it as a multi-purpose starfighter. I guess this was kind of a versatile ship as far as fighter bombers go. When Mon Mothma decided to flee from the capital of Coruscant, it was a squadron of Y-Wings that would escort her all the way to the Outer Rim. Even though they were completely outperformed by the TIE fighters sent after her, they managed to do just enough to get the Chancellor to safety. There's that word again, just enough. And it should be mentioned that, the Y-Wings were performing these missions and taking heavy losses, and that's kind of the character of what the Y-Wing and its pilots would be known for. These were pretty serious individuals who were always willing to do whatever it takes to make a mission successful, even if that meant sacrificing their lives. During the Battle of Atollon, with the Rebel forces trapped by interdictor ships, the Y-Wings again fought valiantly, suffered heavy casualties, and helped the Rebel fleet hold on long enough so that they can escape. The Y-Wings also suffered great losses during Harrison Dula's attempt to liberate Lothal. She would lead a mixed group of Y-Wings and X-Wings against the 7th Fleet, and was the sole survivor of that incident. Gold Squadron would also lose most of their ships during the trench run on the Death Star. And at the Battle of Vargas Vaz, Grey Squadron was easily destroyed by Darth Vader's magical force powers. Despite all the Y-Wing's failures and shortcomings, despite attempts to replace it with the B-Wing, the Y-Wing kept on just chugging along, and it actually was responsible for some pretty spectacular victories, and a lot of that has to do with its ability to counter large Imperial Class Star Destroyers. They're basically the only fighter that could do it, like during the Battle of Scarif, when a group of Y-Wings used ion torpedoes to disable a Star Destroyer, which was then rammed into another Star Destroyer by a Hammerhead corvette. This action destroyed the planetary shield gates and allowed Rebel forces to beam up the Death Star plans, leading to the Rebellion's eventual victory at Yavin 4. And so, even though the Y-Wing was not as sexy as the X-Wing or the A-Wing, or as cool as the B-Wing or other variants, the Y-Wing was always there. It was always around, and it was always willing to do whatever it takes to push the Rebels right over the goal line, whatever it took. Without the Y-Wing, the Rebel Starfighter Corps would have lacked the punch necessary to seriously challenge and destroy the Imperial fleet in a fair fight. Not too bad for a fighter bomber that was 2 decades old and first generation, designed by an organization that never built a fighter bomber. And this is why, during the New Republic era, the demand for the Y-Wing to come back was so high that Connoisseur Manufacturing would actually create a new variant of the Y-Wing that was based off of the BLTA-4 kind of jury-rigged model that the Rebel mechanics made. So there you have it, guys, and that is the story of how this very underrated and humble fighter bomber design won not just one war, but 2 wars against very unlikely odds. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. Also, if you guys are interested in checking out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus, we have linked all of the information in the description down below. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.